So, welcome to the fourth Sunday in Advent. We have been waiting and waiting and waiting. We've been counting up the Sundays as we've been counting down to Christmas, and we are so close. Our wait is almost over. Up until now, during Advent, we have been in the book of Isaiah, looking at prophecy that announces renewal and reversal of power structures, announcing a future that is full of hope, peace, and joy. We've heard words of the prophecy, and in these words, we have seen foreshadowing of Jesus. Today, we shift our attention to the New Testament and we see Jesus. We read the words of an expectant Mary who had just arrived for a visit to her relative Elizabeth, whom Mary found well past her childbearing years and yet still pregnant with her son John. John leapt for joy in Elizabeth's womb when Elizabeth greeted Mary. As I read the account in John, it almost seemed to me like Mary had been holding her breath up to this point. Have you ever had something happen in your life, something big and life changing, but it didn't actually seem real until you were able to share that news with someone else? Maybe you've gotten big news of a promotion or a new job, or maybe a move, or maybe like Mary, when you found out you were going to have a baby. Maybe just until you had shared that news with someone else that you loved and you trusted, only then did it truly become real. It seems that Elizabeth's joyful greeting and response to Mary's news made things real for Mary. For Mary, who had been pondering all of this in her heart, holding inside all of what she was thinking, this response from Elizabeth just seemed to open the floodgates, and wow, the words begin to flow. The passage that we read this morning from Luke is often called the Magnificat, and these are Mary's words of joy as she magnifies the Lord and gives thanks to God for God's blessings. Mary's words here are the most words that have been attributed to any woman in the entire New Testament. And what a powerful expression of words. Things she has been pondering just seem to come streaming out. Mary burst into songs of praise for the faithfulness of God. Praise that God had noticed her in her humility, had looked with favor upon her low status as his servant, and had blessed her. Now, this is not the hashtag blessed kind of thing that we sometimes see if we're scrolling through our Facebook feed or Instagram. It's not the kind of hashtag blessed that paints the rosiest of pictures, where everything is styled and cropped just perfectly, so everything appears just so. This is not the kind of blessed that Mary is talking about. Mary doesn't, of course, know the specifics of how this road of motherhood is going to unfold for her, but I imagine that she has a feeling that this blessing is going to take her on a path that is not going to be easy. Even the unlikeliness of her pregnancy makes things difficult, and yet Mary rejoices over the life in her womb, the love and the mercy of God made real in her circumstance. To those early readers of the Gospel of Luke, Mary's words, when they read these words, they wouldn't necessarily have thought, wow, Mary came up with these words on the spot. You see, these words are deeply rooted in the tradition of the prophets of old. They would have heard Mary's words, and then they would have remembered Hannah's song. The themes of reversal, of reimagined and leveled power structures find their roots in the prophets like Jeremiah, Micah, and Isaiah. Mary's words root her in the deep, rich traditions of the prophets. These words are deeply rooted in the God of justice. The words that we read today have also kind of taken on a special meaning for me this year. I've shared this with some of you, but during the summer, just before I started at Wellspring, I found Mary while I was on retreat at Cincinnati Mound. Now, you might be thinking, I didn't realize she was lost. And Mary wasn't lost at all, but I just had missed her all these years somehow. But the Dominican sisters at Cincinnati were so lovely, and their warm hospitality made me feel so welcome. I was tired when I arrived. The year of ministry that I had left behind had taken its toll on me, and I was a bit weary. I was hopeful and I was excited for what was to come when I would come to Wellspring. And if I was honest, I was a little bit nervous and apprehensive, and all of those things were stirring around inside of me. But the love of God is manifest in the hospitality at Cincinnati. There I found quiet, and I found rest, and I found renewal, and I found Mary. Mary is very present at Cincinnati in the beautiful stained glass in the chapel and in the artwork all around the grounds. The warm welcome of Mary called out to me and kind of helped me to shed some of the baggage that I was carrying around of this image of Mary that patriarchy and the institutional church had provided for me that had me kind of holding Mary at arm's length. I realized that whenever I saw an image of Mary, rather than experiencing invitation, I felt excluded. I don't even know how this was communicated to me. I don't recall someone telling me this, but somehow an image of Mary was a signal that whatever was going on here was for someone else, and it wasn't for me. But at Cincinnati, I experienced welcome. It was as if Mary said, "You are welcome here." And I think we all know how powerful that feeling of welcome and inclusion is. Mary invited me to take a closer look. You know, we sing of Mary as tender and mild. And years of church history interpreting Mary, they've kind of shown her to be silent and subservient and picture perfect piety. And so, as I was wrestling with these questions, I sort of thought, how on earth can I relate to this picture of perfection? I don't know that I see myself here. What does Mary's story have in it for me? And then I rediscovered these words of the Magnificat. We read them every Advent. I preached this text last year. How on earth did I miss this? These words are not the words of a passive pushover that the institutional church had kind of encouraged me to see when I look at Mary. That was the Mary that I struggled to relate to. But these words are strong words. Mary is speaking truth to power. Mary's words make radical claims of God's promise and her place within the larger story. Mary knew that God looked with favor upon her. Upon her, this young, pregnant, unmarried woman from a humble family. And she knew that from now on, generations would call her blessed. She knew of God's strength, that God had scattered the proud. Mary knew that God would fill the hungry with good things and send the rich away empty. She knew that God was working to bring down the powerful from their thrones and lift up the lowly. These are fighting words. These are dangerous, even treasonous words. Ronald Allen has written something that really resonated with me this week, and I want to share that with you. There are places in the world where the Magnificat is not translated from Latin because of its troublesome political and economic ideas. Mary's song, and before that, her unlikely vocation to give birth to God's Son, tell us something important about God, the true meaning of Christmas, and the believer's 365-day-a-year vocation. Young, poor, vulnerable, morally marginalized Mary means that God comes into the world in unexpected ways. Through lives of humble, unlikely, and often excluded, marginalized people. As this young woman averrs, God cares deeply and passionately about people and how they live. God cares particularly about those who are shut out, people who are hungry in this abundant economy. The Magnificat ought to make us uncomfortable with the reality of homelessness in this land of plenty, the reality that millions of our children go to bed hungry every night, the reality that our economy and tax structure exacerbate the gap between rich and poor. God cares a lot about injustice and inequality and poverty and unnecessary human suffering. I think those words are powerful. God cares about injustice and inequality and poverty and unnecessary suffering. And Mary's words remind us that we should too. The words of the Magnificat are not the words of the weak or the submissive. Mary is incredibly faithful. Mary lovingly gives herself to the will of God, and in that faithful act, she stands up to the most powerful humans in her world. This is the woman who raised and nurtured Jesus, after all. Can you see how being raised by this mother sets the stage for Jesus' ministry? These words almost feel like a prelude to the Beatitudes, where the rich inherit the kingdom, and the meek inherit the earth, and those who mourn are comforted, and those who hunger are filled. At Cincinnati, Mary cracked my heart wide open this summer. Why had I kept this woman at arm's length? I spent a lot of my week at Cincinnati in the Magnificat, contemplating this longest set of words credited to any woman in the New Testament. The Mary that Luke presents to us is a prophet in her own right. These words point Luke's readers to a new way of seeing the world. And then they invite us to join her in this work of pondering that allows us, like the prophets, to see the unimaginable. Mary's words are not the words of a wimpy woman that the tradition has kind of encouraged me to imagine her to be. These are powerful words, power and strength found in humility. No wonder dictators tremble at the sound of these words. Mary's words proclaim God's good news to the lowly, to the hungry, and to the powerless. And then this week, I've also found myself pondering, what kind of news is this for the privileged and the full and the powerful? These words can kind of make us feel a little uncomfortable, wondering, where do we find ourselves in this story? Where do these words leave us? And then as I read and reread the Magnificat this week, I discovered God shows mercy to everyone, from one generation to the next, who honors him as God. Herein lies the hope, mercy to all. Mercy speaks to our broken and bruised places. Perhaps mercy is when the lowest of society, the powerless and the oppressed, are elevated and lifted up from their situation. And perhaps mercy is shown to the mighty by humbling. As I've been pondering joy this week in light of our very rich discussion that we had last week and the tension between joy and suffering, I've been pondering again how sometimes our blessings that come in the form of comfort and security and economic blessings and safety, sometimes these blessings become our blinders. They become our barriers to joy and our blinders to the world around us and the needs of others. I've been trying to think of this in the framework of non-duality. In our small group, we've been reading Richard Rohr, and so we've been trying to think about things in a non-dual way. So where we don't divide everything into categories of this or this. It's not us and them, because us and them seems to be counter to gospel inclusion. The mighty being taken down from their thrones may be as much an act of love and mercy for the mighty as the lowly being elevated. Kind of like we discovered the first week of Advent when the lion was laying with the lamb. It wasn't so much about the lamb becoming more powerful than the lion and the lamb assuming the throne and taking the power. It was more about the two laying side by side on equal ground and appreciating the gifts they each have to offer. Predator and prey together in peace and without fear. In some ways, we find ourselves privileged. And in other ways, we find ourselves hungry and broken and in need of renewal. And I think that these words of Mary speak to us in that both and. Mary's words invite us into a new way of seeing the world, pondering the both and like the prophet, she invites us into a glimpse of the unimaginable. Mary is a prophet. Mary is doing what prophets do. She's looking at her own story and reading it in light of the arc of the big story of the working and the dealings of God with God's people in the past. This is what prophets do. They try to find language to interpret the present in light of the past. They look for those threads that continuation of the story, and they find their place within God's story. This kind of prophetic imagination has future implications because it announces a future hope and it invites us to see the unimaginable. We read Mary's prophetic words in Luke and we see Jesus all over this. Interestingly, Mary is not specifically speaking about her baby. She's speaking about the work of God in the past as she looks back to all the ways that God had been with God's people. Mary is speaking about her story that is rooted in the past and the present actions of God. This is a song of joy about finding her place within the big story. That sounds kind of like Wellspring, doesn't it? Enter the story where you are able. Perhaps the act of entering the story where we are able is what calls us to be prophets too. Perhaps Mary is inviting us to be prophets, to find how our story is rooted in the past and the present actions of God. Perhaps we are tasked with finding our place within God's big story. And this is beautiful because God is love and love can't wait. The relentless love of God for creation doesn't wait, even as we are still waiting for the fulfillment of the promise to be made real in our stories and in our world. In our waiting, may the love of God and the love of all creation inspire us to be prophets like Mary and imagine the gospel promise of what can be from within our place in the already not yet of God's kingdom. So I invite you, where do you find yourself in the story? What did you hear this morning?